From Benoit's Cove, Newfoundland and Labrador, this is the Indy broadcast.
We continue to work diligently on behalf of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians to ensure we meet our financial objectives.
The Furey government delivers its annual budget amid major economic uncertainty, a housing crisis, a federal election campaign, and just weeks before the Liberal Party will have a new leader and the province a new premier.
For 2025-26, oil is projected to be $73.
But the province's gamble on oil and gas has one Memorial University professor concerned for Newfoundland and Labrador's future.
The budget is still depending on expanding oil extraction, and that's a problem for two reasons.
We'll speak with Angela Carter, a Canada Research Chair in Equitable Energy Governance and Public Policy.
The seniors advocate says she isn't surprised by the findings of the Auditor General's recent report. And quote her, families have been pointing out these issues for years.
The Progressive Conservatives light a fire under the Liberals in the House of Assembly over the Auditor General's recent investigation into the state of the province's personal care home system, which exposed alarming findings, including deaths. Those stories and more coming up. Welcome to the Indy broadcast for Sunday, April 13th. I'm Justin Brake. On Wednesday, the Liberals unveiled their 2025 budget amid growing economic uncertainty as U.S. President Donald Trump continues his trade war against Canada.
We stand together, ready and united to build and improve Newfoundland and Labrador.
Finance Minister Siobhan Coady announced revenue forecasts for 2025-2026 sit at $10.7 billion. The highest in the province's history. She also said the province anticipates $11 billion in spending for 2025-26 due to investments in healthcare, education, and justice infrastructure, and programs aimed at helping residents and businesses with affordability. The province is facing a $372 million deficit this year, with an expected return to surplus in 2026-2027. And will be borrowing a projected $4.1 billion this fiscal year. But it's the $111 million set aside for the province's fossil fuel sector that has one expert concerned in light of the oil and gas industry's grim outlook, both economically and in the face of a worsening global climate crisis. On Friday, I spoke with Angela Carter, an associate professor of political science at Memorial University and Canada Research Chair in Equitable Energy Governance and Public Policy. Carter is the author of the 2021 book Fossilized, Environmental Policy in Canada's Petro-Provinces. She joined me from St. John's.
The budget is still depending on expanding oil extraction, and that's a problem for two reasons. One, for economic sustainability for the province, also, though, for global and also provincial climate stability. On the economics, and this is where things get interesting because here we have an annual budget process, but we also need a process in the province for understanding what is coming very soon, in the next 3 and 5 and 10 years for the province in particular because of its dependence on the oil and gas sector. So all of the evidence is indicating now that we are going to be, oil producers are hitting irreversible decline in oil demand. And that's going to begin before the end of this decade, so before 2030. Even major oil companies and oil industry consultants are beginning to recognize this publicly. The world of energy, oil demand is shifting, and it's shifting quickly. And we can talk, if you want, a little bit as to why that's happening. But so let's just put that out there as a fact. We have global oil demand that is declining before we get to the end of this decade. And this is really worrisome for governments like Newfoundland and Labrador that depend on covering budget shortfalls with revenues from oil. Because the evidence is clearly demonstrating that all exporters are going to be affected, in particular governments that depend on oil revenues, in particular the places where oil is very expensive. The highest cost producers are going to bear the largest revenue losses per barrel as we move forward. So that's the larger context of what's coming leading up to 2030 and thereafter, declining global oil demand. And Newfoundland and Labrador is very, very exposed given the dependence that we've had on oil. So the issue then with the budget for 2025 is that it's still very much depending on oil production increasing, as well as prices for oil that seem to be overrated, certainly in today's world. So, for example, the budget expects Brent oil to be at 74 US dollars per barrel in 2025. So that's the average that the government is assuming, and it's working its budget analysis off of that. But today, the price is at 63, more than $10 less per barrel. That has enormous impacts across our economy. So basically, the government is anticipating the price of oil is much, much higher than it is right now. That could be a very risky bet.
The province has economists who, help with the budget, and presumably they're aware of this. What do you think the rationale is if government presumably knows this, that it is a risky thing to be doing at this point in time to expand the industry and be banking on it for budget shortfalls? Why do you think they're still doing it?
This is, I think, more of a political and short-term view than a long-term one. And so this idea that Newfoundland and Labrador's oil will somehow still be competitive in a world where global oil demand is decreasing, and that's what's coming, that doesn't align with what's actually happening in global oil markets, even right now. Because what we see is oil firms are being much more cautious in where they're putting their investment. And that investment is not happening in the offshore of Newfoundland and Labrador. Newfoundland and Labrador's offshore industry, it's considered to be mature in the sense that we are past peak production. Peak production occurred in Newfoundland and Labrador in 2007. And overall, we've been in decline. Production has been declining ever since. 3 of our oil fields, the major ones, have produced over half of their total reserves. So again, we're past the peak. And it's only Hebron that is not quite at its peak. But that too has passed its initial production plateau, and that is also now in decline. So when you look carefully, as I'm doing right now with a colleague, at oil sector activity in our offshore, what we see is a decline across all stages. Firms are no longer securing leases for exploratory work. They're no longer bidding on offshore exploration parcels. They're collecting less geophysical data. They're drilling fewer exploration wells. Particularly over this last decade, there is a clear decline in that initial stage of oil activity, which is exploratory well drilling. So if we look clear-eyed at our offshore, what we're noticing is that firms seem to be very quietly stepping away, even while governments, the provincial government, is still pinning its hopes on expanding production. That doesn't look to be the reality offshore. And another clue that we can get to this is how these budget documents are positioning on the Benoit project. So this is fascinating because the government has for a long time been pinning its hopes on new fields coming online, in particular in the Flemish Pass, and the Benoit was to be the first project that would open up that new basin. Now, of course, we know that in 2023, Equinor postponed that project for 3 years, and they did so because of the high cost and market volatility. I just want to stop and underscore that. High cost and market volatility. We are in a moment of extreme market volatility right now. And those costs are still very high in our offshore, so nothing's really changed. Even so, in the budget documents, we are seeing government officials say things like, that the company is still committed to the Benoit project. They're seeing some preliminary stage work that gives them hope that the project is going ahead. That's interesting because when you look at what Equinor is telling its shareholders, in its annual report that it just released in March, just last month, They mentioned investments they were making in onshore wind in Sweden and mining in the US, Brazil for oil, but there was no mention of Beta Nord or the Flemish Pass in the report. And Equinor is still underscoring that Beta Nord's business case is challenging, and it hasn't committed to a time frame for developing it. Equinor is putting a significant investment into Brazil for oil and gas and renewable development, for example, but we're not seeing that here. So these are all signals that we should be listening to about the future of our sector. But instead, what the budget is anticipating is that oil royalties are going to increase even more than what they did after the COVID rebound and when oil prices were surging after Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. So the government is expecting that we're going to have even more revenue from oil than we did at that time. And as I mentioned, they're also increasing. They're anticipating that oil production is going to increase up by, something like 12 million barrels more than what it was last year. So I think this is really an opportunity for us to think, what are the facts? What are the trends that we're seeing in the offshore versus what is hoped for in the budget? Do those two things align? And from the evidence that I see, they don't.
For more from our interview with Angela Carter, check out Yumna Iftikhar's budget story at theindependent.ca. On Thursday, NDP leader Jim Dinn called the budget uninspiring, saying it missed the mark on cost of living measures. He wanted to see the province remove HST from all home heating, a move he says would provide immediate relief. Dinn also singled out the Liberals' failure to sign a deal with the federal government on pharmacare, which he said would have, quote, brought in millions of dollars to cover prescription costs and help people afford the medications they need, end quote. Meanwhile, the Liberals allocated $400 million to Memorial University, an $89 million increase over last year's investment. The money includes $312 million for the university's core operating grant, $13.7 million to support the university's budget, and $70 million over the next 8 years for deferred maintenance. The funding comes after 3 consecutive years of government cuts to the long-cherished tuition offset grant, which student advocates say has made post-secondary education less accessible. While Memorial President Jennifer Lokash welcomed the funding, the campus coalition of labor and student unions who've been calling on the province to restore funding to the university says the government needs to support the university the way it used to. In a statement shared with The Independent, the coalition says it, quote, remains extremely disappointed as the overall funding level from the provincial government is still, even with this slight increase, much lower than is sufficient for the university's operations, and is still a significant decrease when compared to budgets from even a few years ago. We call on the provincial government to commit to a meeting with the coalition and to reinstate funding to the university, as these increases are a fraction of what's needed to sustainably fund the institution, end quote. The Memorial University Students' Union told The Independent it's pleased with the government's decision to pause the reduction of its tuition relief grant and that it's calling on the university to, quote, commit to not moving forward with the planned 4% increase to undergraduate tuition in fall 2025 in light of the recent changes to government plans. In other news, Acting Minister of Health and Community Services John Haggie said Thursday in the legislature that the government has dealt with problems highlighted in the recent Auditor General report into the state of the province's personal care home system. Earlier this month, Auditor General Denise Hanrahan released the findings of her investigation of the province's personal care homes between 2022 and 2024. Among the shocking revelations were incidents including a resident who was found dead after not returning from a routine walk, a resident with dementia who went missing during a walk, a resident who was injured after falling down an embankment behind a home, and another person who was given multiple medications belonging to another resident and then who died as a result of accidental overdose.
We say that there is no acceptable number of serious incidents, not at all. Those that were identified in the AG's report, each of them was dealt with promptly and appropriately, and where appropriate, law enforcement was involved.
But the Progressive Conservatives didn't let up. Here's more from the exchange between PC leader Tony Wakeham and Acting Health Minister John Haggie.
The Auditor General states that these issues go back a decade to 2015. So we have the Minister of Municipal Affairs, who was the Health Minister for most of the past decade. We have two leadership candidates, one who was most recently the Minister of Health and the other who was a Deputy Minister of Health back in 2015. Why are these leadership candidates refusing to speak to this issue, and why has the Liberal government not provided proper oversight for families and seniors for the last decade?
Great question.
We have provided oversight through NLHS. That is their role, that is their mandate to provide oversight. In 2020, we initiated a program whereby every home would have one announced inspection and one unannounced inspection each month. That has continued through COVID, and you saw the success we had there compared with other jurisdictions in terms of the health and well-being of seniors in personal care homes. That continues. We have added 17 full-time equivalents who are responsible through the NLHS for monitoring and assessing homes, and we'll continue to work on the standards as we get to them, one at a time.
The personal care home sector is a valuable part of our healthcare system. We have great operators, we have great staff, and they're providing quality care to our seniors. Speaker, food inspections, school bus inspections, and child care inspections are all published online, yet the personal care homes that care for our seniors and loved ones are not. So I asked the Minister, why aren't these reports made public?
This is something we are going to do. I said that last week and the week before, and in actual fact, Mr. Lane from the Personal Care Home and Operators Association is on board with that. It is entirely reasonable that these reports of compliance are published, but equally I think it's important to highlight those homes that are compliant. This is not everyone's story, and this is a fact that's been brought to my attention by residents of personal care homes who are worried that somehow their home is being brought into disrepute by these kind of things. The member has raised a good point. The Auditor General's raised it. We acknowledge it, and we're going to do it.
To the island's west coast now, where the City of Corner Brook has released draft integrated municipal sustainability plan and development regulations to guide future development in the city. Since 2021, the city has been gathering input from residents and stakeholders to inform its creation of rules and regulations for buildings and the types of development within different areas of the city. Among the key areas the new plan and regulations will focus on are housing and residential development, active transportation, the environment, climate change mitigation and adaptation, urban agriculture, commercial and industrial development, among others. The city is hosting a virtual open house Tuesday evening from 7 to 8 p.m., where residents can share their thoughts on the draft plan. People can also share their feedback through an online form at cornerbrookplan.ca. And Memorial University has released a draft Indigenous verification policy and is inviting public feedback. The new policy comes amid growing concern from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities across the country who say non-Indigenous people who self-identify as Indigenous but have false or dubious claims of indigeneity are receiving educational opportunities and funding specifically set aside for Indigenous students and faculty. The draft document states that the policy, quote, establishes a procedure for the verification of Indigenous citizenship/membership through documentation. Verification is consistent with Indigenous practices around the globe. It's not a colonial practice, but an adaptation of Indigenous ways of being and knowing. This policy is not about determining or verifying a person's identity. Indigenous citizenship/membership is rooted in relationality, unlike identity, which is personal, cultural, and multidimensional. Memorial University does not have the authority to decide who is or is not Indigenous, but rather works to understand, respect, and reinstate Indigenous practices of citizenship and membership consistent with Indigenous practices. The questions that must be asked are, who do you belong to, and who are you accountable to? And the responses provided must be verifiable. Verification will be required for assertions of Indigenous citizenship/membership to or in the university, where that claim may result in material gain, reputational benefit, or where the absence of verification would be otherwise contrary to the principles of this policy." End quote. The document is available online at mun.ca, and we'll also link to it in our show notes. Before we go, The Independent is hosting 2 federal election candidates debates this week. On Monday evening in Corner Brook, I'll be moderating a debate with candidates in the Long Range Mountains riding. That's at the Rotary Arts Center at 7 p.m. And on Wednesday evening at the Memorial University Signal Hill campus in St. John's, Indy reporter Yumna Iftikhar will moderate a debate with candidates in the St. John's East riding. More information is available on our website and in the show notes. That's it for the April 13th, 2025 edition of the Indy Broadcast. You can find our stories, podcasts, and more at theindependent.ca. I'm Justin Brake. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.